Okay, so welcome back to Legacy of Purpose. I'm super excited to welcome Christopher Schroeder, a renowned entrepreneur, an investor, a book author, who has a fascinating journey from running major tech companies in the U.S. to championing innovation in growth markets like countries where I come from, Egypt. Your journey has been far from typical. Based on what I've read, there are certain things I discovered about you that I didn't even know.
After all these years?
After all these years. But today we're going to explore the values that have driven you throughout this journey and your thoughts around the transformative power of entrepreneurship. And, you know, for me, Christopher, you embody in many ways what true leadership means. I've only ever seen you walk the talk. And your overall curiosity about the world and the dedication that I've personally seen you have to making this world a better place is something that is not common and always sits with me in a very special way. So I hope that you all enjoy and take something useful away from this conversation. So Christopher, welcome.
Thank you.
I want to start the conversation from the very beginning of your life. And ask you a few questions about your upbringing, which seems to be very interesting, because you're a child of Italian immigrants who moved here to the U.S., and your family is deeply connected in New York, and your parents were both lawyers. And having read about your family history, how did that impact your own worldview? And what did it mean to be an immigrant in New York at that time? And how did that influence your life moving forward?
Well, firstly, Dina, it's just such a treat to hang out with you. I mean, any excuse to spend time
is.
with you and talk is awesome at every level. So thank you. And so much of my journey, particularly in rising markets and Lord knows in the Middle East, has been structured and founded and educated by you. And so your patience with stupid questions and just helping me navigate so many things has been
no stupid questions.
Deeply personal to me. So
you said rising markets. That's an interesting word. I haven't heard that before.
Well, you know, because I hate the term global South. I mean, I just tell you,
we don't use that either.
I hate it. So I'm not quite sure how to phrase something in aggregate. And since my work takes me from the Middle East to Asia to Latin America, there has to be some way to aggregate the future of the global economy. But so I'm up for any issues, any ideas you have. And, you know, look, I guess some of that ties back a little bit to, it was my grandparents who were all immigrants. I mean, it was a classic Ellis Island story. So my parents were the real kids of immigrants. And it's very funny because you and I have so many friends who are immigrants and what have you. And it's amazing to listen to some of the things which I did not really reflect on until years later about how shared those experiences are. The pressure that parents put on you, the expectations of what you have to do and show up to, this sort of balancing between very, very much of your culture. I mean, whenever my mother would tell stories about growing up, it was always about the Italian community, and all the holidays were dozens of people, all from the Italian community. There was an expectation, implicit, if not explicit, that you would marry an Italian.
Of course.
I mean, so this is all.
You all come together. I know when we grew up, it was like Egyptians stick together and they're a nice little community.
My Indian friends, I mean, when you get talking, it's actually quite amazing how universal this dynamic is. And by the way, also the expectation. I mean, you know, my parents were lawyers. Other kids they grew up with are engineers. Others are doctors. I mean, it's a very sort of classic, if you're going to be successful, you take 3 or 4, paths. But what you don't do is you don't become an entrepreneur, which is really sort of strange in that almost every one of them, by definition of the act of immigration, are entrepreneurial.
Right. You take some risk there.
I went this summer, actually, to the little town in Basilicata in the deep south of Italy, where my great-grandfather came from. My grandfather was born just after he arrived. And it's amazing. You know the stories, you know about the complexities and the difficulties. But when you're actually there in the middle of nowhere, southern Italy, in a very charming town, by the way, but you knew that 100 years ago that the nearest town was 10 miles away and they probably rarely went there. Matera, which was a large city, is an hour away. They probably never went there. And I just had this image in a way that I'd never really thought about it before, walking the town, that at one point, my 19-year-old great-great-grandfather and his 18-year-old wife.
Walked in the same place.
They walked in that place. And at one point, one of them said to the other, I said, I have an idea. Like, let's go to America. And it's an impossible decision. When you're there physically, at a time, of course, where there are no cell phones or anything else, you think about what entrepreneurial drive made them say they would take on an adventure like this. And so it's sort of ironic But the people who take some of the most gutsy entrepreneurial decisions, once they get to places like America, they kind of want the kids to be a little bit more conservative and what have you. But, having said that, my parents always were very encouraging of us to do whatever we wanted to do. So I never felt under any stricture. I think that's a one generation away thing. But I also think it was a reflection of what my parents really discovered once they were raised here.
I feel like New York was a landing place for so many people. Yeah. That's also where my parents landed in the beginning as well. Both your parents were, and so we were just discussing this, some ways champions of the arts, specifically music. And your father co-founded Education Through Music, offering music education to young people in New York.
Inner city schools.
Right. How did that influence you?
There was a soundtrack on in my house all the time, which was classical music. And I think this goes a little bit to the immigrant story, maybe one of the reasons why classical music isn't quite as popular among younger people today. But when you grew up as the sons of or as daughters of immigrants, doesn't matter if you were from anywhere from Central or Eastern Europe in particular, but if you were from Italy, if you were from France, if you were from Germany, if you were from Romania, what was then now Romania, if you were from Poland or Russia, it was understood that you had a piano in your house. It was understood that someone was playing violin. You tried to get to concerts as much as you could. And very much in that tradition, there was like a soundtrack in my house. There was classical music on all the time. And it meant a lot, I think, to both my parents. And I think they felt like it was a connection to the culture, particularly they liked Italian opera and some of that kind of thing that was a part of it overall. And so it mattered. But they grew up in an environment where everyone touched this. So, I mean, my father played stickball with a young kid named Walfredo Toscanini, who was the grandson of one of the most legendary Italian conductors at the time. And he met the old man one time and scared the hell out of him. But there are things like that. My father went to, now it was made into a movie not long ago, but he was actually a boy at the first concert that Leonard Bernstein conducted in, another great conductor that became a legendary figure. And so, I sit and I'm like, wow, he touched all these kinds of things. But I think he would have told you it was just very normal. Like everyone knew someone who served in a symphony or whatever. It was just kind of part of the European immigrant experience.
But his decision to do something to allow more young people to be exposed to music, that's a demonstration of particular values. And I think what I'm curious more about is, I know you pretty well, and I feel like that those values of giving back, always serving. Like I have never asked you for something where you have said no, or asked you for help where you have said no. And I've seen you do so many things for so many different people. Do you think that came from the way your parents?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, my mother went to college at 14. She went to law school at 18.
Yeah, I know. I read that. I was like, wow. And I knew that already.
She was one of two women in all of Fordham Law School. And then one of her first clients was a woman named Lucy Rosen, who was the wife of a man who made a lot of money on Wall Street, had a beautiful estate in upstate New York, and she wanted to make it into a location of classical music and the arts, and hired my mother at 24 to be effectively her lawyer. And that was a journey of 50 years of my mother involved both in music, but also in building this, what was really an education center for young people. Her father served and was friends with Mayor LaGuardia. Like it was absolutely just sort of understood that if you're in a situation of any kind, you should figure out a way to make that situation better and to give something back. It was not discussed explicitly. It was there. And so when Dad then formed this thing called Education Through Music, there were two bees in his bonnet. I mean, effectively, he was stunned that the arts programs were no longer being funded in New York City in many places. The data was very clear to him that if you study music or arts, generally speaking, you tend to do better on SATs, you tend to be more engaged in school, lots of good things happen. But when there are budget cuts, it's usually the first program to go. So he wanted to marry funding of these kinds of programs with his passion for classical music. And he served on the board of directors of my school growing up. But it was never talked about explicitly. You just saw it in action.
Just did it.
People just did it. You see a problem, you fix it. You're in a circumstance in a community, and if you can sort of wave your hand to do something. It was never so much about hierarchy or title. It was just simply like, I have an opportunity to make something a little bit better. I'm going to do that. And that
sounds very entrepreneurial.
Well, it's interesting. You have two lawyers who were, in fact, in a way almost like you would love, social entrepreneurs.
Yeah, totally. I love it. So, you went to Harvard, undergrad and grad. I also went to Harvard. And I think, universities are interesting places, but places like Harvard are also particularly interesting because of the network that you acquire, and the community that you become part of. And, I could talk about all the different communities that you're a part of, starting from your Harvard, where when you went into very young, all the way to the boards that you sit on, like Endeavor or YPO. I met you when you were doing something with the YPOs in Dubai. For me, it seems that you have this drive to always surround yourself with people who will intellectually challenge you, and who will allow you to be curious, but who will also be your friends. And I'm curious to know where that desire to be a part of these multiple communities come from. But also, you're very dedicated. I've seen you be very dedicated member of these communities. And I feel like for entrepreneurs, especially entrepreneurs from what you call rising markets or what we call growth markets, to be able to be a part of a community is often a matter of survival.
Yeah.
When you're really going against so many odds. But for you, why is being a part of community so important?
I think that there's one that's genetic and one that was acquired. The genetic thing is what you said before, is curiosity. I can't explain it to you. I'm just very interested in how things tick. I try to understand people and why they do what they do. And if there's a problem that's been solved by someone, I want to unpack it. And some of it is because of application. Like, I think I can learn lessons from it that maybe I can be better at. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's simply I'm just fascinated by the story, and I'm just loving to see people who are passionate about something and how they made something with it and what have you. And there's never a time in my life where I was a pain in the ass as a kid. People would talk about this kind of thing.
I cannot imagine.
I was apparently true, and it was whatever. The one that was acquired, and it started probably in college, and in part probably a necessity, because as you know, when you go to a place like Harvard, it's got a lot of wonderful aspects to it, and there are things which are a little bit less than wonderful. But the one thing that is true is you are surrounded by very, very smart people who are not shy to give their opinion. And I learned very early on the importance of forming almost a wonder in being wrong, that it's actually a wonderfully exciting, uplifting thing. And I think in the first days at a place like a Harvard, or if you work in whatever your business is or wherever you are, you want to spend a tremendous amount of time proving that you know everything. You want to prove that you're not wrong, and you dig in. And that's my weakest moments, I think, are when I dig in. It's because it's an ego thing. It's not really about trying to get to the answer. But I began having conversations as a very young kid where I get blown out of the water by people who simply knew better than I did. And I went from being defensive to having a sense of wonder. It was a sense of epiphany. I had it wrong and now it's right, or it's better. It never feels entirely right, but it feels better. And I think I fall back certainly from occasion, but really if my career has been marked by something, it's not only a very deep curiosity in the service of getting things done, but also an ability to say, okay, I got that one wrong, but how wonderful. Now I get it.
Now I get it.
Yeah.
You actually said that in an interview. You said that something about Harvard, when you were a student at Harvard, you said you needed to learn quickly how to embrace being wrong.
Yeah.
And you said that when you first get to a place like Harvard, everyone is trying to prove that they're right about everything and that they know everything. And you get a very early lesson in humility, but also a lesson in saying that being wrong is fantastic. Because if you're wrong, you can do better. And, at MIT, it's interesting because here there's this incredible culture of no ego. If you have an ego, you can't innovate.
Yeah.
Because ego is the enemy of curiosity. So I think it's interesting because I think most entrepreneurs I have met who are really kind of sucked into solving a problem, they are the ones who are most willing to say I'm wrong, so that they can figure out how to get to that place that's right.
I had this kid who came and visited and went to school for a few months in Washington, D.C., high school kid from Vietnam. And he was almost, it was almost sort of a cliche. He was brilliant mathematician and STEM. In fact, he literally was the number one math student within 2 weeks in this private school of very smart young people. He had a great sense of STEM, way ahead of many of the kids around him. And I asked him once, I said, so you come here, do you think like our system is like pathetic as compared? He said, are you kidding me? He said, there's no comparison. It's much better here. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, look, I can actually talk to you very intelligently about nuclear power, but I can't apply it at all. We do no application. It's all rote learning. You can't make mistakes actually there because you have to memorize all the things. And he said, my eye-opening experience, which I think captures what you've said and so much of the work that you've done in entrepreneurship, was that he learned most in the engineering club of the high school. Why? Because he watched a bunch of kids make mistakes over and over and over again, and no one got pissed, no one got in trouble. It actually was the ability to solve it and make things better. And he said, we'll never really compete without that. And I think your global experience, my global experience, has been very confirming about that.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I mean, Egypt is the same, right? That type of rote learning is the same. So I still want to go back to this idea of community, and what has driven you to join all these different types of communities, because, I think a lot of our fellows will come and say, what community should we be a part of? Or they'll come to us and say, this fellowship in this community has saved my life. What for you, like when you joined the YPO or any of the professional communities that you have joined and been a part of, what was your thinking?
So YPO, Young Presidents Organization, of which I'm sure many of the folks around here have been members and what have you, was interesting to me because it was global, but it was interesting to me for another reason, which is that you got to meet other women and men who were CEOs who you could have conversations based on two fundamental principles. The first was complete confidentiality.
Right.
And the second was that in that confidentiality, there's no judgment. And the assumption was that anyone who's been a CEO has looked into the abyss. Anyone who's a CEO has had personal problems. They've had problems of a company almost going out of business. We've all had them.
They've made some serious mistakes. And
in some cases, near catastrophic mistake. I mean, some cases, truly catastrophic mistakes. And to be able to put that aside and in a way have this sense of a wonder in being wrong in the spirit of making folks more effective in society, not just in their businesses, was very appealing to me. Like any large network, you meet people that you don't really want to spend a lot of time with, but you also meet people who change your life very, very foundationally. A lot of the YPOers that you alluded to before in the Middle East, like Fadi Gondor, Ahmed Alfi, and others, changed me entirely. Like they completely re-educated the way that I thought about the world, about business, about humanity, about the perception of how one thinks of themselves as an American. I mean, it was that kind of level of depth. And in a way, any organization that I've decided to become a part of its community, and in a way, this is an additional add-on to this concept of having a wonder of being wrong, which is to be with people that don't view you or the operation as a transaction.
Right.
I've become extremely focused in the last 2 decades, and I almost know within 5 minutes who I'm dealing with. You can almost see it in their eyes.
Oh, completely.
Am I a transaction to you? Or is this the beginning of a co-authorship of doing something or making something different? And there's nothing wrong with transactions. I ran companies. You have to sell things. But even when I sold things, I wanted to know the story of the person my customer was. I did care about that at the end of the day. And we all have experiences with women or men that when we can do something for us, they're right there. And the moment it's less obvious what we can do for them, they disappear. And I had some early lessons in that were very clear to me. And it made me understand that I was absolutely going to optimize around women and men who were not driven by the transaction. In some respects, a transactional outcome was a secondary thing from the depth of the relationship that was formed. And I found in that depth, much more change happens. Much more change.
How did you, I mean, obviously, so many of us have dealt with that dilemma of people who are very transactional and just want something from you versus people who really want to build something deeper. How do you deal with those who are coming with a very transactional approach now after these lessons that you've learned?
Well, I mean, first of all, there are always people who will let you down. Also, life is very complicated. There are people who are very genuinely engaged in many things, but there'll be transactional moments. And as I said before, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something that is cautionary. But I can remember that, for example, I'd worked in a presidential politics. And there were lots of people, I was their best friend until we lost office. And then, you see it at that extreme. And I think that was very formative. And so I suppose implicitly, not explicitly, when I'm dealing with someone, I start with the assumption of what can I do to be of service to you regardless, whether you're transactional or not. If you're a decent enough person, if you've been referred to me by someone, then my first mindset, 80% of my mindset is what can I do to help you?
It's so interesting that you say that, because when I think back on many of my interactions with you, you often say, how can I be of help?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. There was a young entrepreneur who I was watching him have a conversation with another woman and say, you know what Schroeder always says at the end of every meeting? And I was sort of curious as to what it was. And every time, apparently, I say, what do you need? What can I do?
It's true, 100%.
What do you need? How can I help you? How can I make your life a little bit better than it was before we met?
I'm telling you, now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like almost all of our conversations, you have always said, how can I be of help?
So the interesting thing is, with that mindset and with some filtering, even when I deal with people who end up becoming more transactional, I've become almost Buddhist about it. It doesn't bother me at all. I still try to optimize away from it. But if I meet with someone and it's a good conversation, I've been helpful to them and they're people of integrity and they move on, it's just a transaction. Who cares, really?
That's what my mom always says. She says, if you can help, just help.
It's a great quote.
Yeah.
I think she's right.
I think she's right too. She's been right about
How do you
things.
handle, because you're this way in spades, and I think one of the things I've not figured out well, and I'm wondering how you figure it out, which is there are only the one gating factor is 24 hours in a day. So how do you manage all the requests that you get and all the desires you have to help people and still have 24 hours in a day?
Oh my goodness. I feel like you just reverse podcasted me. That is such a tough question. I get so many emails every day. I can't answer them all. I mean, I have come to realize that there are limitations to what I can do. Before I didn't, and I would try to fit in and do as much as I could, and I think now I realized that I can't. And
so live with it is the answer, or?
No,
you gate it? Are there things that you will say?
There are things that I pace. I kind of look at those who are coming to me and I think, who is priority and who can I maybe push out a little bit. I will answer everybody. I think that's like a general rule I have. I will always answer because I just think that's basic respect, is to recognize somebody. I will always answer, but now I will be honest about my time constraints. So I will say, if I can make the time for somebody, I will. If I can't make the time immediately, I will say, very honestly, I can make time for you, at this later time. And then I say, if it's something urgent, can I offer somebody else to support? Yeah.
Good for you.
And I give options, but I will always answer, which is also pressure, right? Because I'm sure you're inundated with emails and WhatsApps and all these things. And you do want to help everybody, but
I get 400 emails a day.
I do not doubt that.
It's staggering. And then, WhatsApp is, I'm more efficient on. Some of the other Signal and other, depending on what field of my work it is I make it but I will get back to people, but I've been shocked how often I've buried things and I'm embarrassed by it.
Yeah, it's really hard. I think the commitment I made to myself is that I will answer everybody. But I cannot make time for everybody when they need it in that moment.
Good for you.
And I think, that's just the way it is. Time is not infinite. Yeah. At least the way we understand it in current reality. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, I've only known you since when you started writing about entrepreneurship, but previously to that, you were a several-time entrepreneur. And you started ventures, online ventures at a time where that was just coming about. It's not like starting something now. You were doing it right in the beginning of when the internet came out, right? So I have a couple of questions. One, you could have continued your career working in finance or anything you wanted. Actually, you could have done, but then you chose to go out and do your own thing. And what was going through your mind when you made those decisions?
it was a different era in many ways. And you grow up in New York and you're surrounded, and even a place like Harvard. I mean, even now at Harvard, by the way, everyone will say, I want to do a startup, and 2/3 of them are at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or whatever. So there's always this sort of people fighting their nature versus expectations upon them and what have you. And I think what I'd say to you is I was always very entrepreneurial. I mean, I was entrepreneurial at the point. I was like, people don't believe it now because it sounds much cooler than it was at the time. But, I had a DJ business, which failed immensely after 2 years of great success. And people don't think that I would necessarily have done that. But I did. And I did great stories, and I loved music and made a lot of money doing it until it exploded. But I loved it.
I don't think we discovered that in our research. Was that buried somewhere?
Probably pretty buried. But
there you go, everyone.
But I loved it,
Schroeder,
and we had
DJ.
a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun and made money, and it exploded, and learned a lot of lessons. So I always had the sort of I'm going to do my thing. But I think I would have told you that in the first decade of my career, I was more entrepreneurial. In fact, the first company of scale that I ran was entrepreneurial. I ran the WashingtonPost.com, which was not a startup. It was not a spin out, though it was run very separately from the legacy business. And part of the challenge we had to do was to figure out.
And wasn't it one of the first to go online?
Well, all of them around that time. New York Times had a great guy who was building one who I learned, frankly, a lot. This in a way goes back to the community stuff. I've often found that every business I've run or been a part of, I'm often quite friendly with my number one competitor. And I must say one of the people I admired most at that time was a guy who ran NewYorkTimes.com. And we actually did some co-authored projects and stuff to raise the industry overall while we elbowed each other and that kind of a thing. So I was hardly the only one. And I also I came in at a time when there was something up and running that I had to sort of reorganize and fix. And then we took it to a different level. But it was entrepreneurial. I mean, I was entrepreneurial, but I had a balance sheet. I had a brand. I had product that had existed, which is night and day from making, when I made phone calls as the president of WashingtonPost.com, people answered them. When I was broke out with, Sequoia and a lot of very good investors, and I'd call up people and say, I'm Chris Schroeder from Health Central. Like, who the hell are you? And they don't call you back. And you learn that there's a big distinction. But
difference in brand.
Different in brand, different in organization, different in, it's all the kind of stuff we were talking about, the transactional elements of it and all. But I will tell you that I had in my teeth, even throughout WashingtonPost.com, that at some point I had to do this myself. Like, it was interesting what I was doing, and I loved news, and it was an interesting time in history. But
and then you started healthcare.
Then I did HealthCentral.com with some
But
other
Health
people.
Central was also backed by some serious players, including Sequoia.
Yeah. And that was great. And it was also pressure.
Carlyle Group. It was definitely backed.
Carlyle had a venture capital wing back then, and they were back it. I think the lesson that I learned there is, the money is important. It does actually open doors. But I had unbelievable board members. I mean, these men just got up in the morning, went to bed at night, and it was very, very helpful to me. They were totally of service. Alan Spoon, who was the president of the Washington Post and then became a very successful venture capitalist in Boston, he never did not answer an email or a call within minutes. It was unbelievable. Mike Moritz, who became a legend in Sequoia, if ever I needed something, it was astounding to me, the speed with which they would come up with an introduction or get on the phone with me to brainstorm a problem or whatever. And so the pressure of having that kind of money and just raising money and the pressure that is a startup was all there. But I must say it was ameliorated by the team, and it was ameliorated by having people around me who really were trying to help us succeed.
So what would you say, especially with Health Central, because that was something that you co-founded and built from the bottom up, what would you say was the most gratifying moment for you as an entrepreneur, and what was the most difficult?
Well, the difficult's easier because in many respects, there's so many of them. I mean, and I say this to entrepreneurs all the time. I mean, the difficult ones are almost every day. Often they're people related. I mean, I cringe most, and I think a lot of CEOs cringe most when they realize that they probably should move somebody out much faster than they did. And the ramifications on the organization, on the culture, on the person is brutal. And I have tremendous embarrassed regrets by not doing those things better and those tough decisions more timely than I did. So there's always the people issues are always the hardest.
People talk about that all the time, this issue of you need to fire quickly and get rid of those.
It's kind of true.
It is true.
It's really true. I mean,
it is really hard to do.
You get caught in the cycle that good enough is good enough, and that the vacuum of not having a role filled, particularly in an early stage company, has got to be worse. But if I'd looked in the mirror and said, something for 6 months or whatever it takes, get the right woman or man, I'm going to be head of sales or head of whatever, like that's the right answer. Like I should have been that way. And I thought I could either fix it or get a little bit better, or I could find someone in parallel. And the culture recognizes that. People wonder if you're really on top of your game.
Yeah.
And for the person themselves, if it's not a fit for them, it's not that they're screwing up. I actually think of that as a CEO screw up. I'm having a baseball player playing soccer.
We forget that most people, if you need to get rid of someone, it's probably crushing them too.
Crushing them. And often they really are very talented, but you got them playing the wrong game.
Yeah.
And so you have to help them get to the right fit and that kind of stuff. So that was the tough stuff. The positive moments, I would say there's a broad one and then one specific to Health Central. The broad one was when you watched people realize they could make a difference in what they were doing, and they did. Like this aha moment where you could watch people self-elevate almost by the act of them taking on something that none of us thought we could actually do, or individually they couldn't think they could do, and not only they did it. And really well. Like you just, the multiplier effect of what that did also culturally and to the success of the operation, I think was very profound. I mean, obviously winning big deals and all that kind of stuff was, you get sort of excited by that. I think the mistake a lot of entrepreneurs made, and I made sure not to make this mistake, was that when you raise money, particularly your second or third round of capital, that somehow or other that's a victory. And it is not a victory at all. The number of people go public and they think they can go back on their laurels, or they just raise another brand round and they think, okay, we kind of won. In point of fact, this is where it gets even harder.
It's even more difficult.
And so but I was pretty alert on that kind of a thing. So, it was just very exciting. But, it was tough. It was very, very tough. And I think a lot of people, they saw, movies or, HBO dramas or whatever, and they think this is all a bunch of laughs. And, you got to want to solve a problem in your teeth.
It's not really all that sexy.
No, it's not sexy.
So I know the story of why you founded Health Central, but I would love for you to tell those who are going to listen to this podcast, because there is a story behind why you.
Yeah, there's a personal story that laid into a theory of the game from a business perspective. And I feel that I and a couple of other people at the time co-founded something, but what we actually did, which in many respects was a mistake, is we rolled up some other health properties that had good brands that we thought we could then expand. And in many respects, I think everyone underestimates how tough it is to do even a series of small acquisitions. And a lot of times we got caught in the mire of different cultures and stuff that you find under the covers that you don't find in due diligence that slowed us down. So it was a co-founding almost of an acquisition vehicle that became then a company unto its own. But it started personally. So this was at a stage, Facebook had just been up and running. A lot of the social media was up and running. But I had two personal experiences that were very profound. I had a very dear friend who eventually lost his battle to bipolar disorder after an incredibly brave battle. Very, very gifted guy. He was a great speechwriter and policy guy in Washington. He was a speechwriter for Carly Fiorina and at Stanford, and very gifted guy, but he suffered from bipolar disorder, and eventually he couldn't win the battle. And then a little bit earlier than that, my mother-in-law was given what was clearly a terminal diagnosis of cancer. And what I found, digging in the internet this time, was that there were all these little groups of people who'd been there or were in it. Mm-hmm. And you would not even necessarily share each other's names. I don't think I knew any of the identity of the people I found. These groups were either you just found them or they were part of a university or whatever it was. But all of a sudden you were in a room with people as narrow as friends with people who have bipolar disorder, or the son-in-law of a woman with adenocarcinoma. Like the level of specificity you found was unbelievable. And with that, the level of detailed answers and care and genuineness was off the charts. And 60% of it was about, treatments and medical things. But almost half of it, 40% of it, was definitely about how you live your life on a day-to-day basis.
Through it.
And it was so hard to find these things, and they were so powerful. The original thesis of Health Central is, what if we could aggregate a bunch of these sites and have experiences where people could find people just like them, not necessarily care who they are, the content that they needed from a very genuine place of experience. And, you get sucked into, you need to be another portal of healthcare stuff and how many doctors you have involved and everything else. And I had to sort of keep that, the way it was done, a bit at bay to try to unleash something that had not really existed at scale at that time before. And we ended up doing a whole bunch of stuff with medical things. We did have doctors and things like that. But the real thing was, I'm a 32-year-old woman with a pain in the ass husband, and I've been diagnosed with breast cancer. Do I tell my children? Like those were the kinds of questions that were coming up as much of what treatment should I get? And so that really was kind of the essence of the proposition. And with that came a business model, because the theory was there's a tremendous amount of money in healthcare. And that money would rather not reach 10 million random people, but they'd rather reach 30,000 people who are actually going through the experience.
Right.
And you'll get a much more greater performance on that and do pretty well with it. And I must say, I was right in part, and it was such a bigger slog than I thought. We had to get through all sorts of regulatory issues. The regulators at that time of the FDA did not think that people should advertise drug information around social media. It was crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And I had to testify before the FDA and do a bunch of shit that no entrepreneur should have to spend time doing, but I had to do it. And the outcome ended up, though, we built something that was impactful. I think we saved people's lives. And, we ended up selling it, so it was okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you actually embarked on it. But I think the reason why I wanted you to share that origin story is because even with that, it started by you still wanting to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
Right. And
I looked at the news business that way. I mean, to me, I mean, in some respects, like in hindsight, you and I can look at our career and make it into an arc, and you and I both know that it's much more of a sine wave. You have these highs and these lows and ridiculous mistakes and everything else. And then in hindsight, it looks like an arc. But to the degree that in foresight, there was an arc for me, it goes back to my curiosity stuff. I found that if people had better information, they made better decisions. And the unleashing, this is why I love entrepreneurs now, because entrepreneurs are about unleashing individual potential. It's about, I've got a problem in my teeth and now I want to be able to solve it. And the best way to do that is often starting with amazing information. And I think most of the companies I ran at the time had that element to them.
Yeah. I love it. It's what we ask of our fellows, right? You have seen a lot in your life. And you've seen you've seen the entire evolution of technology kind of take over our life, right? You and I grew up without the internet, without phones, without cell phones, without smartphones. We didn't have any of that. And then all of a sudden, our lives changed. And I think, I've seen you talk about the power of just the smartphone and what happens when you put a smartphone in the hands of a poor person in a remote rural area somewhere in Africa or in Asia or anywhere. And you talk about how technology is actually power and can actually be used to generate jobs and prosperity. And you've been a huge voice for the adoption of technology and innovation within countries like mine. So my question is, where is that coming from? Why are you so dedicated to that particular agenda? And why also in our markets?
So there's a foresight element to the question. And in a way, it's a cousin to what I said before about the empowering of information to make better decisions. With technology unleashed, smartphones certainly did this at scale. But what it really unleashed was a very clear and specific, not fluffy sense of empowerment. And that definition for me, I saw this at Health Central all the time. If I see someone like me, looks like me, is from my economic strata, my age, whatever I identify myself in, if I see someone like me who takes hold of something and it works, that means I can do it too. And the unleashing, I think, that is so powerful about smartphones, obviously being able to buy things and all that and have banking, if you never had it before, a part of the equation in a massive and revolutionary way. But I think what is sometimes underestimated is the act of seeing people just like me doing all sorts of things. And that means if they do it, I can do it. We can all take a swing and make our lives better in a more constructive way. And it was very, very clear to me that this was true in America. It was certainly the story of so many of the entrepreneurs, most of whom came from nothing, many of whom are immigrants. But then when I started getting exposed to parts of the world, you see it in stage. So before I got to the Arab Middle East, my first exposure to this was because I ran companies. I did what gringo CEOs always do, which is I outsourced technology to almost any emerging market, we called it that then, from Argentina to Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And you get cheaper engineering.
Yeah.
Unlike a lot of gringo CEOs, I actually went and visited my partners on the ground in these places. And it was very clear within hours that these women and men were not simply getting up in the morning, going to bed at night so I'd have cheaper engineering. They were looking around them and saying, why is there no Amazon here? Why is there not even necessarily in the case of the Middle East, there's no email here in Arabic? Why is it that that 80% of our country can't get a loan other than going to a loan shark within their community? They're asking all the obvious whys. Why? Because of what I said before, they'd either been around the world or saw the world and said, people like me are doing it, so why can't I do it here? Secondly, they're great entrepreneurs and they knew it would be an opportunity. For most of them, very impactful. When you talk to Marcos at Mercado Libre, which is a juggernaut e-commerce company, you know he had in his teeth not only to build the Amazon of Latin America, but he knew it would revolutionize lives there. And I came away from that trip saying something much bigger is going on here that was different than anywhere else. In the case of the Arab Middle East, I was involved in a group, it was through YPO, of Arabs and Americans talking about a time when the only narrative of the Arab Middle East in Washington and certainly America
was conflict.
It was just war and disaster.
War and disaster.
ISIS was in your bed, pick whatever it was. Here I'm meeting women and men across the region who are like, what are you talking about? Like, yes, of course there's this stuff going on, but there's something else going on. And honestly, I didn't really believe it, or I thought it was a sideshow. I mean, there were engineers in Egypt, I had no doubt, but were they really going to change things in light of the bigger forces that I understood them? And Fadi and a couple of other people put together the first major gathering. I think it may have been the first time I met you.
That was when we met. So at the Celebration of Entrepreneurship. In 2010.
2010 in the fall. And, there are a couple of things that were happening in parallel. One, there was like 3,500 young people from around the Arab world who were there who did not give a damn about any of the political stuff or Obama speeches or Israel or anything from a geopolitical perspective. They had it in their teeth that they had tools to solve problems. Secondly, there was 3,500 young people on a waiting list to get into this. Mm-hmm. Third, after that trip, I actually went to Egypt for the first time in Jordan and saw it all in the ground happening there as well. And I came back and said to myself, something is happening here combined with what I'd seen in other parts of the world that is going to redefine the global economy and redefine innovation globally. And needless to say, a month later, most of those young people were in Tahrir Square or whatever protesting something different.
You started writing this book as, the so-called Arab Spring was taking foot. And I remember when you went to Egypt because I helped organize a visit for you to go visit Tawassul, an NGO that I had co-founded with Yasmina.
I remember very well.
And where we had built a school and provided access to income opportunities for the people of that community. And then I know that you went into writing your book, and I just want to tell this story because you started writing your book. I was in the U.S. when the revolution in Egypt started, and I remember you would every day you would text me to see how I was doing until I finally made it back home, and you every day, how are you doing? How are you doing? And I felt like you were checking in on everybody. Which was really beautiful because I felt like you had developed this very unique bond with our part of the world that was very special. I'm not even sure that you even realized how deep it had become and how fast it had become. But you ended up writing this 200-page book about what was happening in the entrepreneurship space in the Arab region. And there was a lot happening at the time. What was it that you found most striking about that part in time in the Arab region with regards to how entrepreneurship was evolving versus what you see now, almost, 13 years later? Because I feel like every time I go back, there's like an evolution. Things are changing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. A friend of mine just told me it's the 10th anniversary of the writing of that book. And no tech book lasts a week, let alone 10 years. And
I feel like you should write a part 2.
Well, I know someone else who's running a part 2. Noor Swide is writing.
I know. Noor told me about her book.
And I'm very excited for that. I think it's good that it's now someone. I mean, I think she was one of the pioneering people also.
Absolutely
and
was.
She's of it and in it. And I think she'll have, I'm much happier to be helpful to her than be kind of an external reporter on it. I think it'll be a more genuine book and answer some of the questions you just raised. But what I would tell you is, that friend of mine just looked at it for whatever reasons. If you read the introduction of my book, a foreword was written by Mark Andreessen, and the conclusion of it, all the themes of what was changing about human interconnection and the unleashing talent have held up entirely. The stories, who succeeded or who failed and who came after the book, all that, the book is way too dated to be relevant in its detail. But I think it hit a lot of the issues that were important to the Arab world, but is important pretty much everywhere, because it goes down to this idea that we have in these tools, for all the criticism people like to give of social media and what have you. We have an unleashing of capacity and capability that simply was not possible for them. And even you go to the Middle East now, and obviously the way the political situation played out much differently than people had hoped and aspired in many ways overall. Saudi Arabia barely appears in my book. Barely appears.
Yeah, now if you wrote today,
you'd start there.
It would be right there. It would be
Dubai. Dubai was in my book some, but even then, Dubai was very expensive, and in a lot of respects was viewed as kind of a private equity, not venture capital mentality, big real estate projects and big companies and what have you. And then no one could afford to live in Dubai, and of course that's changed dramatically. But Saudi Arabia was literally like a market for e-commerce. They had money, and you could sell stuff there. But the idea that there'd be entrepreneurs, let alone women entrepreneurs, being unleashed 10 years ago, of course, was completely off the radar. So now here we are 10 years later, and I think the core thing which is shared is the desire from people who have a problem in their teeth that they have to solve, has the capabilities and tools to do so with a market that's much more adept to doing it. I mean, we forget COVID in some respects was, for all of its horridness, was an unleashing of people's engagement and understanding of how to use technology in their lives on a day-to-day basis. And a new generation of entrepreneurs have just leaned into that to be able to solve some really big and thorny questions. And I see now incredibly exciting companies in Saudi Arabia and UAE, and there's still fantastic companies in Egypt. The ankle weights, the countries who choose to unleash this talent are making the right choices for the 21st century. The countries that are deciding they still want to contain this or make it hard for young people to do it are missing the greatest opportunity.
Which brings me to an important point. So here at the center, we always talk about bottom-up growth through venture development, that entrepreneurship can be the critical pathway to achieving prosperity that is sustainable, inclusive. But that also requires political will.
Yeah.
And I don't think when I think of my country and what it's going through now, especially with the economic downturn and the currency issues and the devaluation and the fiscal scarcity mindset, if we had, 30, 40 years ago said instead, we want to invest in bottom-up venture growth that is driven by technology, where would Egypt be today? So on many levels, there's political will involved. And we saw that happen live in places like the UAE and Saudi, which really was very recent when the government decided to go full force into supporting technology and innovation and entrepreneurship and backing that with money and providing capital. But you've traveled, across the world. You've traveled in the Arab region. You've traveled now in the ASEAN region. I know you've been to some places in Africa, Latin America for sure. Why is policy and politics so important when it comes to unleashing entrepreneurship and when I say entrepreneurship, I'm not talking about like your traditional SME, but really those innovation-driven entrepreneurs who have the potential to grow fast and create jobs and completely transform systems. Why does it matter so much?
Look, I mean, it matters because it matters. I mean, at the end of the day, the regulatory environment, the ability to get money into an investment and get money out is by definition rule of law. The ability to bank people who have never been banked before is by definition going to run into regulatory circumstances. I mean, there was almost a naivete, kind of a Silicon Valley started naivete, that you can move fast and break things and you'll deal with government later once you're so big. They're not going to mess with you in the same way, and you're going to always solve problems bigger and faster than them. And by the way, I'm not saying that that's completely wrong, but I will say at the same time, in the reality, particularly in the markets where you and I focus overall, it's really naive. But having said that, if you were to ask me now, who are some of the top countries who are really getting ahead of how to think about fintech regulation, who think about fintech not as an extension of banking alone, but are thinking about what it takes to make them succeed, to meet with the entrepreneurs, to meet with venture capital, and try to actually create both enabling capabilities, whether that may be infrastructure or a rule of law, to make them succeed. It would surprise a lot of people. I think Brazil has been very forward-leaning here.
I was about to say Brazil.
Very forward-leaning here in a way that I'm not sure America is. Indonesia has had very positive moments. Definitely. And that surprises, I think, a lot of people. But look, at the end of the day, one, a lot of the leaders are a generation older than you and me, meaning that all this stuff they don't quite understand. I think lots of them feel—
Generation or two.
And they feel very threatened by what they don't understand. There's tremendous lobbying and political pressure from business as usual to not have things that will disrupt. I mean, the dynamics are very, very real and need to be understood. At the end of the day, I think one of the great capabilities of the best entrepreneurs you and I have ever been behind is a sense of persistence. Mm-hmm. They're going to get headwinds somewhere. And unfortunately, in many countries, those headwinds come top down. And that means that you almost enable a brain drain. And so, look, every leader of every country is making a choice. And that choice is, do I want to unleash this or do I want to contain it? And those who contain it will find themselves not well in a competitive position in the next century.
Yeah. And I feel like and you've heard me say this many times, is that it requires a massive mindset shift to really see that your people who can solve problems are actually assets.
Well, my favorite quote in the book, my favorite quote probably in my experience of the last 15 years, the one I quote all the time. No,
not in your experience in the last 15 years.
It is, because it summarized so much. And it was from you. And it was this distinction that you made between top-down mindset and bottom-up entrepreneurial mindset. And you said that effectively top-down mindsets, this is true in America. You talk to NGOs and God knows government people very, very often who I think are very well-intended and very decent people who really do care. But top-down mindset looks at people as problems to be solved. You poor people, we will fly in, we will solve you, pat you on the head on our way in and out of doing so. But the bottom-up mindset, the unleashing of the entrepreneurial mindset, is people are assets to be unleashed. But the fact of the matter is a lot of political power is not happy when people get unleashed. And by the way, history sometimes is on their side. But that is the trade-off. You captured that trade-off beautifully in that distinction.
Yeah. And I think, when I think about companies like M-Pesa and what that did for the people of Kenya, right? And also more broadly Africa now. Or when I think about Souq.com and, you've met Ronaldo, Ronnie, and one of the things that I never knew about Souq.com, which was acquired by Amazon, is that in the beginning, in the early days of them trying to deliver these products, through this e-commerce platform, in our part of the world, we didn't actually have addresses.
Gulf had a Saudi, it was almost impossible to live. His stories are hilarious.
Right. And like even in my country, in Jordan, in Lebanon, it used to be, you would say, my house is on the corner of blah, 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 with the kiosk that has this written on it, and just go down. It's 4 buildings down. But addresses were never used, right? It was done by like symbols and things. And he actually had to actually get addresses written. And that created a massive opportunity to be able to have all these addresses. I guess the question is, if you're a policymaker and you're listening to this podcast in countries that are still hesitating to really embrace and adopt technology as a way to achieve their prosperity, but also to develop the kind of regulatory environment that would allow their own entrepreneurs to thrive in their own countries without leaving, what advice would you give them?
Look, I have to tell you that I'll speak from America's perspective because I get involved in this. I think never in the history, at least in my lifetime, has the intersection between policymaking, business, and technology overlap more at a necessary level. Yeah. And I just think it's descriptively true, whether you're talking about military tech, health tech, education tech, or anything overall. And having said that, it is very striking to me how most of the government institutions, one, are so swarmed with people who've never had experience in running, managing, or really leading an organization in a private sector view. A lot of them have limits on their access to use technology on a day-to-day basis because of security issues or everything else. And they really speak different languages. I mean, I've brought some of the real poobahs of Silicon Valley and certainly AI to meet very smart, very, very top people in our government and elsewhere. And I literally will sit in a room with 3 or 4 people, and I walk away stunned at how you have such bright, such caring individuals, and I think for the most part they really are, who one is speaking Koine Greek and the other is speaking Latin. Yeah. It's less, there is a miss of language, there's a misunderstanding of the analogies that they make and a disconnect. And so my answer to your question is, and regulators tend to want to go after problems first, they want to kind of justify their existence first, and what ends up happening is they don't have the language or the experience of the people who are most affected. And part for me is to really get embedded. The Brazilians did this very well. Very early on when they decided they were going to have fintech regulation, they brought in the entrepreneurs themselves. They brought in the expertise who have to live under these regulations and made trade-offs according to that.
But I think with them, they did it at the right time. I think when Egypt did it, it was too late. But
I'm going to be a little bit naive here to say that it's never too late. Like if you're actually willing to embrace the feedback and want to make a choice to unleash this phenomenon, it's not too late.
Yeah.
But if your instinct is this thing called AI appears, and I'm going to be the first out of the box, Europe, with regulations here, and I'm just going to sort of jam all my data protection learning into a very different kind of an animal, and be able to declare victory. And like you sort of say to yourself, is that really in the public good? And certainly is that in a good that's going to make you competitive in the world that we're facing right now? And these are the questions people have to look in the mirror and say, what is it that I want to be? Now, the fact of the matter is there are a lot of women and men who don't care.
Yeah.
That's also true. I mean, we can have a whole podcast just about how politicians think about education. And at the end of the day, if you're not serious, if you're not trying to do more and more to help this young generation have the tools and capabilities for the 21st century,
ultimately, it's going to impact your country.
Yeah, and you got to look in the mirror and say that. But many politicians obviously are more short-term focused, and they have different incentives, and they don't, again, really understand what you take for granted, and it makes it hard. But it's not impossible. There are enough examples where people know something's happening. I would think that any country in the world should look at places like Dubai and UAE and how they in Saudi Arabia are leaning into AI and saying, not unlike what I said before, if they're doing it, why can't I do it? I've got a lot of money, or I've got a lot of energy, or I've got access to GPU, or I have very talented young people. But you have to use your imagination.
I mean, personally, I'm not sure exactly what led to the UAE and Saudi really embracing AI. What was that turning point? Regardless, they're at a place where they're really embracing it. And not to name which African president, but, I spent some time with a president in Africa who very openly said to me, he's like, Tina, for me, AI is very scary. And, I don't know what to do with it. And I don't know what good it can do for my country. And, so a part of it for me became, are we also, when we think about all the work that the World Bank and IMF is doing, educating people about technology and advanced technology in particular and how to use that to actually create prosperity is not on their agenda.
No.
What's on their agenda is squeeze, put everyone in a scarcity mindset. And that doesn't create change.
No.
It creates fear.
Right.
And I'm at a point where I feel like for Africa, and I know you've been writing a lot lately about the ASEAN region, and you've been traveling a lot in Vietnam, Taiwan, China. I mean, that's on my list. I'm so jealous. But we need to find ways to kind of break down that fear barrier and also overcome a lot of the kind of very structural, I would say, suffocating mechanisms that also exist in these governments.
I don't know how to crack it. And the suffocation is true.
Yeah.
The legacy of many of these governments is heavy, but then you have to say to yourself, at one point, a leader, because it really does boil down to leadership. The leader woke up one day and looked at the desert and said, I'm going to build an enormous city here that's an economic hub of the world. And I'm going to go study Singapore. I'm going to study other people who've done it. And I'm going to have my own version of it. But I want to study it. And you, without naming names, you and I know a leader in Africa who studied Dubai and studied UAE and studied Israel and was going to be that in Africa. Hasn't happened yet. And so, there are all these kinds of trade-offs. But I think very often in life, this is true in running a company, and it's true in assessing a macro conversation like this, that if you really unpack the incentive structures in place, you can almost predict with 100% how people are going to act. And the fact of the matter is this technology, particularly now, I mean, we've had a similar conversation 10 years ago with mobile capability, but now with AI, we really are in new territory. And it's quite understandable for people to say this may move in a place where either it could be dangerous for things that are in my incentives or my understanding, or I'm going to get dwarfed. I'm going to be a pawn yet again in the China-America game or whatever it is. So you have to be creative. But at the same time, you start asking yourself big questions, which is every kid in my country can have within 5 years, can have a personal tutor in their hand. Like, what does that mean? What can that do?
The future progress of my country.
We will cure cancer with this ability to manage data in a way that was unimaginable 5 years ago.
Inshallah.
But I'm just saying it's there, but you have to have the mindset that says not only do I have to regulate things because of a reasonable conversation of what can get off the line, but at the same time, I'm going to say to myself, I'm in a unique position in the history of the world to be able to solve the problems. And in theory, that's why I'm there. But that takes a certain leadership mindset, and they don't come around that often.
No, they really don't. That's where there's scarcity. But since we're on that topic, you've been traveling a lot in Asia. You've traveled extensively in the Middle East, Africa. You've traveled in Latin America. And, the U.S. is your playground. Do you think there's going to be a new playbook for technology and innovation that moves away from the kind of Silicon Valley playbook that everyone has been emulating?
Like everything in life, it's like talking about the Singapore model. I think there are things that work, and if people are smart, they will take them and leverage them. And there are things which are, either get long in the tooth or they didn't even work in the time, and you make a choice to do it differently, or your culture or society or things that you want may be different than that thing overall. But there's a reason why, after a period where people are starting to write off Silicon Valley and the problems, God knows, of the tragedy that became San Francisco as a city and the infrastructure around it, and COVID, people moving to Miami and whatever else, there's a reason why there's a massive sucking sound of the most capable and talented people from around the world in AI gravitating back into that area. Because one of the things that we have learned, for all the power of virtualness, is that there really is still, it's almost back to your community conversation earlier, a desire to be in the same room with people who are solving big, big problems. And you want to be around the best of the best. That network effect of talent does not happen often in history. And I think every country that cares about this stuff is asking, can I in some way prime to do that? I mean, it's very interesting when you look at countries, and we come back to Saudi Arabia and UAE, and no country is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But what's one of the determinants that they've said? They're like, I'm going to have open visas so the best talent on earth will come here. Yeah. Like, that is a statement about where you want your ambition to go, not only in theory, but in application. And the idea that people would say, well, Silicon Valley's past its prime, they're just being naive, because the fact of the matter is there's still incredible talent that likes to aggregate there geographically. Now, we can say that talent is everywhere, which I do believe, but the fact of the matter is there'll be some AI companies that come out of New York and Chicago and Austin and what have you. But there is a reason why there's a recipe of the network effect of talent wanting to be around itself. And that's the secret sauce that I think in some respects, we never know how to do that except in hindsight. But it is magic.
In Boston, right? Anybody who wants to do anything in relation to biotech somehow finds their way here, even if it's for a brief moment in time. I think for us, we just hope to see more of these hubs in other parts of the world.
I think the beauty is, at least for a period of time. I mean, there's a period of time, I think a couple of years, where more Indians were leaving America to go back to India than to come to America, which was a major statement when you stop to think about it. I don't know what those numbers are like now, but at the end of the day, great entrepreneurs are globalists almost by nature, in that, I'm not making this as a geopolitical statement, but they will go with the least amount of friction to succeed.
Oh, totally. We have some fellows who are quite like that. So almost my last question, but kind of my last question. I'm going to ask you this question for Donovan, right? I think, the world is I would say, not a great place. And, we were talking, there's so many things in the world right now that it kind of makes you sad, right? But at the same time, when I read your pieces and your experience, what your experiences lately in Asia, and even if I go back to your book that was published 10 years ago, there's something about your stories of entrepreneurship that has a promise of deep hope.
Yeah.
And I remember something that I will always, always hold close to my heart. And in the kind of worst days of Egypt during the uprisings and the revolution and what was happening, and, I once said to you, I'm not optimistic. And you said, it's okay, you don't have to be optimistic, but you always have to be hopeful.
Yeah.
And I've always kept that in the back of my mind. When you look at, what is happening in the world and what is happening with regards to technology and the enormous potential that, I feel that AI has the potential to really help countries leapfrog and completely transform systems that are deeply broken if they just embrace it. But I guess my question to you is, in the midst of all these terrible things that are happening in the world, there is this place of hope, which we call entrepreneurship. What does that mean for you?
Well, the sense that I've had about optimism versus hope is actually stolen from a wonderful quote that I can't do quite justice to of a really remarkable man, Václav Havel, who was the first real president of Czechoslovakia after the Berlin Wall fell. And it was interesting because he became a great leader of the country as a playwright. He was a political activist, was in prison and so all that, but he actually was an artist first and foremost. And I think thought of himself that way. And he made a distinction. He said optimism effectively is like it's all going to turn out well. And hope is, sometimes things don't turn out well, but they made sense. And I've always held on to that distinction because I think at the end of the day, and the entrepreneurs are case study one of this, are women and men coming all the time of multiple generations who see a problem in their teeth and they want to solve it. And in an almost Buddhist sense, the macro doesn't slow them down at all because they can't do anything about the macro, but they can do something about this problem in their teeth. And when you spend time with all the amazing people of multi-generation around your world, a lot of them are younger, but not all of them, and I get to see all the people around the world, you don't leave those meetings without fired up. It was a wonderful experience, actually. I was just a judge for the Schwarzman Scholar Program. Steve Schwarzman from Blackstone Group started this 10 years ago, and it's kind of a Rhodes Scholarship, but bringing mostly Westerners, but global students to spend a year at Tsinghua University, and they've built a beautiful campus there. And this is an extraordinary group of young people. I interviewed almost 40 of them. And every one of them, when I read their application in advance of it, I'm like, we're going to be okay. Like, these are just amazing young people.
This is what our future has in store.
And they're not all entrepreneurs. Some of them are social entrepreneurs. Some of them are professors. They come from all different passion, but there's something in their teeth. And they come at it with a sense of that there are problems out there and not solving them does not make sense. Solving them makes sense. And maybe they'll win, maybe they'll lose, but they're in. And, I think that's a very powerful reminder because we forget that throughout history, there is terrible war, and there's now breathtakingly terrible war now, and there's political abuse and there's criminality of all sorts of natures. We try to pretend that the norm is not that, when in point of fact, with any sense of history, the norm is that in many ways. And it is these folks who are sort of like, despite that, I'm showing up, that makes all the difference going forward. I think one of the things that marks this period different than any period in my lifetime, other than AI and technology, which is massively different, and I believe we're in the earliest innings of beginning to appreciate that, is that we're in a world order where the world order is being questioned everywhere. Right. All the bumpers of behavior, to the degree that there were some bumpers that either were implicit or explicit, people are testing them everywhere. There's not a part of the world where there's not a woman or man saying, I know 10 years ago I never could have done this, but I can do it now and I'm going to try. And America, I just wrote a blog post on this. I mean, America's having a hard time understanding that what they need to do in the world is not tell people what to do, but to compete. Compete for ideas, compete for execution, compete for great product and services at a great price, because everywhere around the world, people are saying, I have alternatives. China's an obvious alternative, but it's not just China. It's everywhere else. A world of choice is actually a very hopeful thing in the macro scary scenarios that we all know are there. And I don't pretend that these things could not spin out in a way that is of a historical era. But you have to remember, I cut my teeth at 21 when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union disappeared and there was war in the Gulf. And people now look back on that as a historical event that seemed just to happen pretty decently. And they forget how much everything in the world seemed to be on its ear at that time. And at this time now, all the ways that we think about life, and you and I were raised to expect about them, are at least being pushed on, if not questioned. And in that, it can be disarming. But in that, of course, is unbelievable opportunity. And I think that people tend to gravitate towards success. And if people actually not say they're great, but actually show and display and compete as great, that could be a very interesting period that we're going into. We'll see.
It's interesting that you said that, because your friend Fedi Randour once said to me, competition is a fantastic thing.
It is a fantastic thing.
Because competition leads to excellence.
He's right.
And without competition, what we have left is mediocrity.
Evidence, I think, whether it's in history or art or dancing or entrepreneurship, is utterly on his side. And we look at our own personal experiences. Yeah. There's so much that we do because we all work hard and we care, but we always take it that extra foot because we have someone coming up behind us. That's just a natural aspect of human nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So my last question for you is, you're at a moment in your life, your kids are grown up and you've had an amazing career and you're spending a lot of your time studying other markets, writing about other markets. I don't know why you often refer to yourself as the in and out gringo, because I don't actually believe that to be true. I don't think there's anything in and out about you. I feel like you always go and deeply immerse yourself and really think about where you are, and with deep curiosity and humility. So I would encourage you to stop using that word. But anyway, my question is really, when you look back on your life, what do you want people to say is the purpose? What would you like your legacy of purpose to be?
I mean, first of all, I am an in-and-out gringo. I mean, and I think the recognition of that is not a weakness, it's descriptive, meaning the difference between all the experience I've had in the Middle East and spending 15 minutes with you is just night and day. It's just night and day. It's a night and day when I get to talk to people like you in other parts of the country who live it and of it and have been of it. And my experience, my questions are better with each year, but my depth of understanding the good news is I have pattern recognition across a breadth of experiences, but I am in and out gringo. And it's a reminder of me, that term actually reminds myself that when I start getting comfortable, that I think I understand what's going on, I still don't know shit.
Yeah.
And
well,
that to me,
for every one of us,
but absolutely true in whatever form, but we all should be conscious of that and remind ourselves of it. And part of that humility of being wrong and loving being wrong, because that's how we evolve. I don't know. I'm not sure yet that I figure out if there's a legacy, if anyone's going to give a damn that I existed a day after I go off to the great startup ecosystem in the sky. I will tell you, and I said this recently to someone, I didn't even remember that I said it, but it was true. There's no question that among the biggest legacies I'll have are my 3 children. I mean, they, were profoundly interesting and very funny and very self-effacing. They have deep passions and things that they do, but they're not defined by those things. But they are of service. They think of everything they do every day of making somebody's life a little bit more informed, a little bit better. They have this sort of wonder of being wrong in many ways. And again, they're very funny. And the multiplier impact.
I've met them all. Wonderful.
The multiplier impact of these kids, I think on the world will be absolutely one of the biggest roles that I've played on the planet. And I think sort of as a corollary to that, the ability that everyone that I've touched at one point can say, not only was he asking me what he could do to make something happen or what have you, but I'm doing that now too. You'll never measure that. I'll never be able to look at a balance sheet or an income statement and say the people that I've touched took elements of that and were able to do that more for others. But I think more gets built that way. I think more success happens that way. I think we can leverage understanding in a much more profound way that makes lives better. And so, I'm very proud to have built and sold businesses. I'm very proud to have exit in a company I invested in. That's all nice. But I really think the big key, and the entrepreneurs that I admire most are the ones who are constantly learning about how they can have multiplier effects among other people's lives. And, the frustrating part of it is you can't measure it, but deep down it's happening. So that would be it.
Well, I would say that anybody who knows you or who has interacted with you will always take away that one question that you ask everybody, which is, how can I be of help?
What can I do to help you?
And that's
how can I make your life a little better?
Wonderful, wonderful thing. So Christopher, thank you so much for making the time to join us on the podcast. And, for me, I know that I always enjoy my conversations with you. And I think it was really important for me. The minute I knew you were coming to town, I said, Donovan, I want to share what I have learned about you over the years with others. And so I want to thank you for being with us, and thank everyone who's listening for listening. And I hope they take away from it what I have been taking away from you over the years. And if there's a lesson anybody can learn from you is, what can we all do to help, even if it's a small thing? So thank you again for being with us.
Thank you for you and your friendship. It's been wonderful.
Yeah.